Okay, hello everybody. My name's Tim Besley. I'm chairing this event today on behalf of the Royal Economic Society, and you're all very welcome. I know there are people joining us from all over the world, and I think there's two reasons why there's been so much interest in this seminar. The first, of course, is that we're all currently experiencing something quite unprecedented in all of our lives. In this outbreak of the coronavirus that is having both deep effects on society and on the economy. And many people are trying at this point to make sense of what we're all experiencing. The Royal Economic Society decided to therefore lay on a series of webinars, of which this is the first, with some major speakers who can provide us with a way of navigating through the very major both policy and intellectual issues. And that brings me to the other reason why so many of you have logged on today, and that's because we have Darren Acemoglu and Jean Tirole as our speakers of the day. They are each going to speak for approximately 15 minutes, and then there will be a period when we can have some Q&A. Quite how that will be able to work with such a vast audience, we'll have to work our way through. But without any further delay, I'm going to hand over to Darren, who's going to make his presentation.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks to the Royal Economic Society for organizing this. It's a great pleasure to be talking to all of you, and it's a great pleasure to be sharing the stage with Jean. So let me see whether this sharing worked. Okay, so I'm going to talk about unknowns, challenges, and opportunities during the current pandemic. I think we are clearly going through a very uncertain times. Our whole world is very different today than it was 6 years ago, not least because there could be millions of deaths, and we are probably in the midst of the most severe recession that we have experienced over the last 90 years. And perhaps, and I'm going to put some emphasis on this, there might be many political changes coming soon. So in some sense, we are experiencing something like the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic, the Great Depression, and the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, all rolled into one. But unfortunately, I think there are also a whole set of issues that we don't fully understand, and we have to adopt a lot of policy stances, but we are forced to base them on imperfect knowledge. So what I want to do in this talk is actually emphasize 4 areas where I think there is need for more thinking, research, and evidence-based policy, and it's not just for the short term. I want to sort of, some of those are relevant for the short term, but really also looking into the future, because hopefully soon there will be a post-crisis world. So the questions I want to focus on is the first one. I think that's the one most immediate actually, is how economic and social behavior interact with epidemics. And in particular, dynamics of infections, I think, are key for our current conjecture, for our current situation. And I want to put some ideas on that on the table. The second is about supply chains, which I think are also relevant both for now and the future. And the third is about, what were the institutional and societal problems that actually led to failures and delays in government responses in many places, including the UK, Italy, US, Turkey. And also I want to spend a few minutes on what the pandemic will imply for the future of economic and political institutions. So for the first one, I think many of you have become much more familiar with the SIR, susceptible, infected, recovered model that epidemiologists use. And I want to just show a few equations from that just to motivate 1 or 2 questions. And the classic SIR model is, to economists, is a bit like the Diamond's famous coconut model, where people run into each other, and when they run into each other at some rate, they create new economic and social effects. And here, the key issue is the infection. So susceptible population runs into infected population, and at the rate beta, which is the contact rate, that needs to new infections, and at the rate gamma, infected population improves, and so the change in infected population is just given by a simple equation like this. So for economists, it's a very natural thing, but of course, the SIR model was first proposed 50 years before Diamond's paper, and sort of just like in Diamond's paper, the fact that there is a increasing returns to scale in the matching technology, in fact here it's like quadratic susceptible population times infected population, means that you can have very fast increases. And the key parameter, of course, is what epidemiologists call R0, beta over gamma. So the rate at which contact leads to infections divided by the recovery rate. Now, lockdowns could be potentially very effective here. Again, if you take this quadratic structure or increasing returns structure in matching into account, because if you lock down, for example, you reduce the susceptible population that is, around by delta, by theta, which is a number less than 1, then you're reducing both the susceptible population and the infected population that are in the streets. So the rate at which they match is going to be smaller. So that's going to lead to a theta square. So that's where the powerful effects of lockdown would come from. And so the transformed R0 parameter would be beta times theta square over gamma. And many people, both economists and epidemiologists and public policy practitioners, are now using this way of thinking about the problem. And I think it has a lot to teach us. So this is the Chinese data from a paper that came in Cell a couple of weeks ago. And this is the behavior in Wuhan. And one way of interpreting this behavior is that if you look at the early parts, for example, with purple, you have very high R0 above 3, and then later on perhaps around 2.5 or above 2.5. So you see the very fast exponential growth. But you can also see that with the variety, for a variety of reasons, once this R0 or RT number starts coming down, then the number of infections and the number of deaths start declining. So you see the peak here as soon as the R falls below 1. And in fact, if you can reduce R to less than something like 0.5, just like the yellow curve suggests, you're going to have very rapid declines in the number of infections. So therefore, when you look at the successes in places like Wuhan or Hubei province, one natural way of thinking about this is the success of lockdown. And I think that's quite plausible. But there is a lot of uncertainty about a lot of the parameters that really you would need to put into these models, you do put into these models to make sense. And I think this is the one set of questions that I want to raise in that context. Actually, beta is not just the immunological or epidemiological parameter. It's actually an economic and social parameter. It's about the form of interactions that people are engaged in, and it relates to how they spend their time outside, to their economic activities, to various customs and norms. So it is possible that all of the effects that you see in the previous figure are due to lockdown, but plausibly some of it is also due to, even when people are not locked down, they're doing social distancing, they're interacting in different ways. Different subpopulations are behaving differently, and they have different matching rates with other subpopulations and different immunity or different susceptibility to the virus. But also, I think most importantly, economic transactions change because of the virus, because technology is going to be used differently and adopted differently. And all of these are actually relevant because they suggest that not just for forecasting what's going to happen in the future, but also about how to handle the return back to work is going to depend. So it's, one naive way of thinking about it would be to say, well, when we return back to work, it's going to be just like before the peak. But that's not necessarily the case, because depending on regulation, depending on how norms have changed, depending how technology has changed, you can actually have very different types of economic and social interactions. So I think one set of issues is about measurement, but another set of issues is what are the levers that we have for controlling how people interact during such times, through information, through regulation, through laws. And I think those are actually important questions that we have to think about. Another one that's relevant that I want to just put out there is that, of course, in a globalized world, there's going to be a lot of cross-country linkages, which are often missing in the most basic ways that we think about the dynamics of the disease. The second point I want to the second theme I want to touch on, again, since I'm touching on 4 because I'm not giving any answers, I'm more posing questions. So supply chains. So I think so far macroeconomic policies in the West and elsewhere have rightly focused on 3 urgent problems. Transfers to people who are losing jobs or suffering economic hardship. I think that's critical, and I think that's the most important thing. It's in part that and other measures limit the collapse of aggregate demand, providing liquidity to businesses through monetary policy and other measures. But I think it's as important to start thinking about supply chains. When people are kept away from work and when companies start going bankrupt, that's going to create strains for the supply chain. And in the modern world, especially over the last 30 years, supply chains have become very complex. They're partly international, but even their domestic component is extremely complex. Work that I've been doing with Alireza Tahbaz-Salehi, for example, as well as some other work, argues that amplifications of short-run and medium-run shocks or opportunities can be much amplified by changes in the supply chain. So for example, failures in the supply chain can have an order of magnitude larger effects than other types of multiplier effects through working through neoclassical channels or even the regular input-output sort of interactions that work through quantities and prices. And I think that sort of issue might be quite central in the current context because there are going to be a lot of bankruptcies. So the question is, how important is it going to be? Is that something that we have to take as seriously as the other 3 elements that I've put up there? And also, what is the right way to intervene in the presence of supply chains? For example, if you're worried about businesses in a world where every business is standalone, you have to help them all either through aggregate demand or through liquidity to each of them. Well, in a supply chain, it might be that some critical parts of the supply chain need much more attention, and that might actually revive the rest of the supply chain. So there are actually opportunities as well as challenges when you are dealing with supply chain. So there's some work in this area, but there's much more thinking necessary, both theoretically and also from an applied point of view. Institutional failures. Actually, one striking thing is that of course, there are differences in the conditions that in every country, but the variation in the response to the pandemic far exceeds any sort of variation in the conditions. There is the speed with which public health measures were taken, testing, tracing, investments in bolstering the public health system are hugely different, even within the set of developed economies. Why? Well, I think there was going to be a lot of soul searching on this, but I want to put on the table the idea that this is very closely related to the atrophying of the capacity of state institutions. And there has been a lot of reasons for this, in my opinion, and I think we have to think about them both again in the short run, but again for the future as well. I think one important part is the erosion in public trust in state institutions. This has various reasons, some of it related to inequality that I think has been important. There is a perceived or real capture of politics by the financial and business elites. There is a response to the global financial crisis that created a backlash. There has been a related but distinct weakening of technocratic or autonomous civil service as a political strategy in many countries: Italy, the US, the UK, Turkey. And if you look at it, this is not a random list. These are 4 countries that I think have all botched the response to the crisis. There's a general underinvestment in social safety net, the hyper deregulation wave. I think we have to rethink all these issues. And of course, what I don't have time to talk about, but I think it's going to be critical in the next 6 months, is that we're already dealing with extremely weak state institutions and low resources in the developing world, and the pandemic is going to create real havoc in the developing world. So we have to think about these issues. But just to put some data up there very quickly, this is trust in state institutions in gray and trust in government in brown from Asia Barometer, World Value Surveys, and the European Value Survey. And there are 2 things here that are interesting and I think really have been at least thought-provoking for me. One of them, these are all very low. The level of trust in state institutions is low, except in a few places like Scandinavia, Singapore, and China. There is some patterns that are relevant for thinking about the problems that we're having, but actually one thing that doesn't square well with the first instinct you might have is that actually trust in state institutions is actually high in many authoritarian countries like Singapore and China. So why is that? Well, this might be what Timur Kuran called, almost 30 years ago, preference falsification. People fool themselves or tell others because that's what they think others want to hear, because they live in an authoritarian world. This is not real trust. But one question is, even this is not real trust, can this still be exploited during times of crisis more effectively than complete failure of trust that has happened in some places like the US, like Italy? So there's some interesting questions that I think we have to go back and think about trust and how we can use it, because I think this emergency is not going to be the last emergency that we'll have to deal with, and mobilizing state institutions is going to be quite relevant. Finally, what the future may hold. Well, I have convinced myself, of course you may not be, but I have convinced myself that we are at a critical juncture, meaning that this is a time when our institutions can go in many different paths, and there will be some countries that take some paths and others that take others. And in particular, what types of political actions are taken, what leadership is shown by politicians, civil society organizations, and also some idiosyncrasies of existing institutions is going to play an important role about how we deal with these critical junctures. I list here only a few of the questions to which I think we just don't know the answers. Will there be a backlash against globalization or greater international coordination, because we realize lack of coordination has been really costly? Will the fear created by the pandemic turn us towards authoritarian leaders? You know, there's a thesis in social psychology that that's exactly what happens. This actually goes back to Adorno's work in political science and social psychology. Or will this thing make us recognize that these authoritarian leaders, by destroying technocracy and expertise, have actually contributed to millions of deaths around the world? Will we end up with an overeager, supercharged Leviathan with no regard for privacy, because you need to overrule privacy during such times of emergency, and you need government, as we are seeing in many parts of the world today in the West, the government to take on much greater responsibility in the economy, increase taxes, increase borrowing? Or will we have a way of building a better but still shackled Leviathan? Will this lead to a better understanding of the value of public health, social safety, more democracy, less democracy? So I think those are all up for grabs. But I think we can learn from some historical episodes, both about what might happen and also how we can work towards making the more desirable scenarios more likely. Well, there was a similar set of issues, not identical by any stretch, after the Great Depression and certainly during and after World War II, and many people worried about this leading to lots of bad institutional outcomes. So in 1942, for example, much of the audience here is British, so they know very well. The Beveridge Report came up in the middle of the war, emblematic of the rise of the social safety net and the welfare state in much of post-war Europe, and it was enthusiastically received by the British people. It gave people a boost during the darkest hour of the war, and its provisions started being implemented right in the middle of the war, while Britain was under attack from Germany. And after the war, it was wholeheartedly embraced. But Hayek, the brilliant economist, political scientist at the time at the LSE, disagreed and worried that this presaged the state's dominance over society and lead to a new totalitarianism. He said, even a strong tradition of political liberty is no safeguard if the danger is precisely that new institutions and policies will gradually undermine and destroy that spirit. I think Hayek would have had exactly the same reactions to the economic and the social responsibilities that are being asked to be shouldered by current governments today in the age of the pandemic. Was Hayek right? Well, actually, something very different than what Hayek worried about happened. You know, perhaps it's not Hayek's ideal set of political arrangements that developed after World War II, but after World War II, in much of Europe, and actually in Sweden first after 1932, following the Workers' Party's victory, a democratic but more welfare state-based political system emerged. So how did that happen? Why wasn't Hayek's worst fears realized? Well, the framework that's, of course, I don't have time to explain, but is summarized in that figure from my book with James Robinson, my new book with James Robinson, The Narrow Corridor, says, well, much of the West was in the narrow corridor where state and society were balanced. And when we asked state institutions to shoulder more responsibilities because we had to deal with uncertainty, poverty, greater regulation, better aggregate demand management, society also became more vigilant, more active, and democracy deepened. And we didn't create an out of control Leviathan. We created a more capable Leviathan that we then managed to control quite well in much of the West. And as a result, we got much better public services, much more stable economy, much more investment in R&D, and we did not sacrifice democracy. So it sounds too good to be true, but perhaps it wasn't all that bad. So I think we are at the cusp of something similar. We need even greater coordination, both international and domestic, much better regulation, a new way of creating social safety net, ways of dealing with privacy concerns while still being able to mobilize resources at the times of emergencies. So I think we need to have new ways for society to become vigilant, which is particularly hard because over the last 2 decades, we have seen society become less politicized and less able to engage in democratic politics in some ways, which I don't have time to go into. But I am an optimist, so I think there are ways in which we can rebuild our institutions and perhaps prove Hayek wrong again, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Darren, for some really provocative and interesting thoughts there. Our second speaker is Jean Tirole. So Jean, it's over to you now, and then we'll try and have some Q&A thereafter.
Okay, thank you, team and friends, for organizing this. It's a pleasure for me to be sharing those thoughts with you and Darren. And as Darren said, we have to be very humble because it's a new form of crisis and we don't quite know what's going to happen. But here are a few thoughts. I'm going to focus on the economic crisis. Let me turn to slide 2. Okay, so let me talk very briefly about the response to the short-term distress. To belabor the obvious, there is a very high cost relative to previous epidemics because there is a lockdown. And with emerging economies on top of that, you will have a drop in commodity prices. In tourism, you will have foreign exchange denominated debt. And the second obvious thing is that there is very little more hazard involved in it because if people cannot work, if firms cannot operate, it's not their fault. So you have to protect the workers, the unemployed, the self-employed. You have to protect the productive structure. We have had job retention schemes, protecting the SMEs, protecting the firms in the most affected industries and the banks. Slide. Now, at the same time, we have to limit the damage. So we have to support. There is no point stimulating the economy yet because there's not going to be more production anyway. And we have to limit the debt. I'm going to come back to that. So there should be no open bar. So for example, I'm not in favor of a universal check for everyone or broad-based subsidies to business. I would favor things more like means and job testing support. And the second thing, which is kind of obvious, is that we must facilitate return to work in a way which is consistent with public health. When teleworking is not feasible, you need double testing. Slide. Slide. Medium-term management. There are two related questions on medium-term management. The first is on debt sustainability. There will be a high increase in public debt, and that's completely unavoidable. That has to happen. But that's a concern for emerging countries, but not only for emerging countries, also for Southern Europe, which is already pretty indebted and doesn't grow very fast. As you all know, it's easier to sustain debt when the rate of growth is higher than the rate of interest. Now, in the short run, the rate of growth is going to be relatively small. There won't be much investment and a lot of lot of trust, but at the same time, I will bet the rate of interest, the real rate of interest will remain low because of precautionary savings, because of low investment. So when I look at that, I will think that an increase in public debt may be sustainable because the interest rate won't be higher than the rate of growth. But that requires, of course, the absence of speculative attack. So you need trust in the public debt. The second related issue is who will pay the bill for a crisis? And here I see 5 scenarios. The first scenario is we reduce our consumption and we basically repay the debt slowly by generating primary surpluses, meaning budget surpluses before paying interest on debt. Slide, please. The second hypothesis is restructuring our debt reputation. And I think it's a very risky strategy because the state will lose, people will lose trust in the state. So the state will have to balance its budget immediately because it will not borrow. At the same time as you will have to restart the economy, honor the guarantees, pay current expenditures, and so on. So that sounds very risky to me. The third hypothesis is exceptional wealth tax and income tax on individuals, of course, and some of that will happen on the rich for sure, but if you want to raise substantial amounts, you have to also tax the middle class. And taxing on banks. So that's called financial repression, or that's one of the aspects of financial repression. And there are many ways of doing that. For example, you force banks to buy sovereign bonds at a high price that doesn't reflect the subsequent inflation. I think that would be very difficult to do in the Eurozone because the banks are already fragile. Then you will have some kind of agreement needed among countries on how to share the repression. And then it will be a lot of risk-taking because already now, you know that you don't have to put, the banks don't have to put any equity in front of the loss they might incur if the sovereign debt they own default. On top of that, many of those debts are debts in their own country. That's called the doom loop. Those are very risky situations. Next slide, please. Fourth hypothesis is debt monetization. So basically, the central bank buys back debt. In theory, that's inflationary because there is more liquidity, more money around chasing the same goods, and therefore there should be inflation. Now, in 2008, after 2008, the big surprise is that despite massive injections of liquidity by central banks, there was no inflation. That's in part because of the precautionary savings, because the banks started hoarding more, there were deflationary expectations, and so on and so forth. Now, it's an interesting option. We have to keep in mind that the poor have many of their assets in nominal savings, so if there is inflation, they will suffer a lot. And the elephant in the room, of course, in the Eurozone is budgetary discipline. When I say budgetary discipline, by the way, I've moved the cursor quite a bit. It's not the budgetary discipline of 5 months ago. It's budgetary discipline given that we have to spend a huge amount of money now. So there will be big budget deficits, and that's quite normal. And finally, the fifth hypothesis, and that's specific to the Eurozone, and that's being discussed today, is introduction of Eurobonds or Corona bonds. So basically making the countries jointly liable for the debt of each other. So it basically goes beyond the existing tools of solidarity. There's a lot of solidarity now happening through the ECB, a little bit through the European Stability Mechanism, not much because it's subject to conditions. And it consists in pooling of debt, which would be beneficial for Southern Europe. But of course, Northern Europe is not going to like that. And it's unlikely to happen on a large scale, at least until recently. I would still bet if it happens, it will happen on a small scale. It's much easier to use ECB support. It can be set up very quickly. It's much less transparent to public opinion, and that's more likely to happen. Next slide. Now, the million dollar question, I'm sorry. is it going to be business as usual, or is it going to be a wake-up call? And that's a little bit what Darren was talking about as well. So there are several dimensions to that. The first dimension is, we as citizens, are we going to change our behavior? It is known from social sciences that after external wars, civil wars are different, of course, but after external wars, people tend to join social groups that tend to experience more empathy. Of course, most of it is parochial, it's toward the in-group. But here the in-group is very big because the out-group is the virus. Unless people start fighting with each other, calling that a Chinese disease, or this mentality, every country for itself, prevails. But there is an issue of collective awareness. We have to basically show more solidarity. Now, next slide, please. Next question is, will policymaking take a longer-term perspective? As you all know, our policies, especially those with remote consequences, tend to demonstrate myopia. And that has gotten even worse with populism, because populism insists quite a lot on the short term. The most obvious example is climate change, but you can extend that to education, to inequality, and many other things. And now we know it extends also to healthcare. Even so, a pandemic like this is no longer a rare event. We hope it's going to remain a rare event. But if you think about the melting of the permafrost, liberating ancient viruses and bacteria, antiviral resistance, biological warfare, and so on, this is a very big threat. We have to prepare for it. And more generally, the theme is, are we going to evolve toward less consumption and more investment? And that would be desirable, and it's not very easy to achieve. So a couple of things we could think about is, first, a norm-based intervention. So trying to convince people that some behaviors are antisocial and are frowned upon by the population. We have tried that for climate change. It didn't work very well. But when it's combined with incentives, it can be sometimes very efficient. We can try to change national accountings. It's an old story about trying to put more emphasis on investment and penalize investment less. Of course, it has to be non-manipulable, because if you start not counting investment into budget deficits, then governments tend to classify everything as an investment. Even consumption is classified as an investment. Finally, I think we should set up more independent observatories. They have to be very independent, but basically try to assess the long-term public performance of governments in matter of healthcare, but in other matters as well. Just look at the PISA ranking or Shanghai ranking, which are not that great, but still the citizen in countries that the educational system actually is not the best in the world. Actually, sometimes it's the worst in the world. So it's very important for democracy to have more information. Next slide, please. And let me conclude with a few notes on globalization. So there's been a lot of criticism of globalization during this COVID-19 crisis. It predates COVID-19, of course, with the inward-looking populist attitude, my country first. There's a lot, of course, the most reasonable people will call for reshoring. And some of that has to happen, of course, but let's be careful with that. I think there's a big tension between the repeated demand of population for more purchasing power, and the yellow jackets in France, for example, and the double whammy which is going to happen, because we are going to have a loss of purchasing power coming from the crisis. And on top of that, you will be adding a loss of purchasing power coming from the closure of borders. And as usual, the choice is not between globalization and no globalization. The real question is how to get rid of the perverse effect of globalization. It's an old debate. We have seen that we are not that good at compensating workers who have lost their job due to imports or technological change, especially in the US, but even in Europe, we're not that good at doing that. We're not that good at anticipating transition to protect those workers. But now we have learned that we're not that good at predicting disruption in the supply chains. And I will insist, and I'm going to do that, in a distinction between those for essential supplies like national security, the response to health crisis, or basic foods. Next slide. And that will be my final slide. This distinction between supply, which are essential in crisis time, and the others. So for supplies which are essential in crisis time, the market just doesn't work, because the market, in order to procure those which are going to be sold very rarely, with very low probability, has to charge extremely high prices, which for various reasons are not desirable. On top of that, for some of those, you have externalities as well. So the market just doesn't work. It has to be the state doing it. And if you want to learn how to do it, just look at electricity markets. So electricity markets are markets. Generators compete to supply electricity. However, for those plants which are used only a couple of hours, a couple of days per year, they will have to ask huge prices in order to remain in operation, and the state intervenes. I will distinguish that from ordinary consumption of goods, where there will be a very big consideration of the supply chain. And Darren talked about that. It's very important, but it's more a prerogative of firms. They will lose market share if they lose their customers. And here I want to emphasize a distinction, because we have to resist lobbies. If you start saying, oh, we are going to protect or favor national firm in public procurement, then every industry is going to apply for a special treatment on the ground that it's essential. So we have to restrict that to the supplies which are essential, but those have to be supplied by the state. And then we have to be flexible and clever. Reshoring is not resilience. And actually the disruption in France was due to China in January, February, and then was maybe due to Europe in April. And of course, we also have to follow the technological evolution. So for example, it may be the case that we can use 3D printers in order to manufacture ventilators. They are slow, but they actually can be used for that. And many other things that might be very important, so we can produce locally. Let me stop here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jean. Also some very important issues that you touched on. So I'm getting some questions in, which I'm going to pose to both you and Darren, and you can choose which of you answers each question. Let me begin with two questions. A pandemic like this was forecast many years ago, for example, in Nathan Wolf's The Viral Storm, published in 2011, but the world was unprepared. Are there new international institutional arrangements which need to be put in place for when the next pandemic arrives? Second question, analyzing the impact of the COVID-19 crisis will doubtless involve cross-country comparisons, allowing the impact of severity and different preventative measures to be assessed. What critical data deficiencies do you think should be addressed to make this analysis informative? And then a question, Jean, you briefly touched on populism, but I know Darren will have a view on this too. Coronavirus kicked populism from the frontier of the political economy research agenda, but there are interesting interactions, specifically very different reactions among populist regimes, Orban and Netanyahu, using lockdowns quickly to strengthen authoritarian power, while Trump and Bolsonaro are trying to avoid it as much as they can. Any thoughts? Okay, so there's 3 questions for you to get going, and there will be others. So I don't know how you want to carve up answers.
I can talk briefly about the first one. So the answer is yes, we need more institutional arrangements. We need more multilateralism. Even in Europe, I mean, when you see that we cannot agree on the end of the lockdown, try to coordinate countries for the end of the lockdown is going to be extremely complicated. The WHO, of course, has done things which were not quite right, but doesn't have enough power and is too political an organization, I would say. We need independent organizations, and we need to do better. So let me take the example of the Basel Banking Committee on banking supervision, which actually has set up minimum requirement for banks, conduct audits, publishes things, and it has had an effect. It's not perfect, but it has had an effect. So the problem is, again, with populism and my country first, which is all the authoritarian regimes populist regimes in particular, want their country first. They don't want to be bound by international rules. But it's a moment, and this crisis shows it again, where we need more cooperation.
Yeah, if I can add a few things, I completely agree with what Jean said. I think this crisis really does lay bare the extent to which international cooperation is necessary in every field. The globalization is not going to disappear, even if there's a backlash to it. And I think we haven't really understood how global every aspect is. For example, national healthcare has always been claimed to be a national policy away, even in the European Union. And clearly pandemics show that's not the right way to approach it, and you need international organizations with greater muscle. But I want to emphasize that the problem that we're seeing is not just or even mainly lack of international cooperation. It's really domestic institutions that are failing. So it's the domestic institutions that really should have been aware. CDC should have understood the nature of the crisis much better. As in January, the National Security Council in the US should have taken actions already in February, not only in March. Well, why didn't they? Well, that's the atrophying of state capacity that I was trying to talk about. For example, the National Security Council, the part that dealt with infectious diseases and pandemics was disbanded by Trump. CDC, was sidelined in many decisions, and there was demoralization in general in the organization, and no ability for people to sort of use their expertise or raise their voices. So I think, and this is not unique to the U.S., although the U.S.'s case really illustrates it. And I think the interaction between populism and the response and what will happen is actually critical, because when you see, it's not just Brazil, you see it in every place, that the populist background is really affecting how countries are or are not able to deal with the problem. For instance, there will be a lot of countries that will not greet IMF with open arms, even though new policies, new facilities from the IMF would be critical for many developing countries, including Turkey. But if you look at the rhetoric in Turkey, it's still extremely anti-IMF. I mean, it's not only populist faults. IMF has made many mistakes in the past and continued to make them even recently. But international coordination, international resources for developing countries is critical, and that's going to be something that interacts with the populism and their institutional structure.
Okay, some more questions coming in. Following the pandemic emergency, when trying to stimulate the economy to restart, to what extent should governments take this opportunity to address climate change and other long-term issues? Another one is, you've stressed two things that need to happen for the good outcome in a world of pandemics: long-term thinking and policies that act on social norms and incentives together. Since the burden of the pandemic falls on the most fragile, for whom the long-term thinking is most costly, do you see a need for fundamental change in the rules of the game in society and economy, analogous to the changes that followed the Depression and World War II?
Should I, or Jean, do you?
Well,
okay.
Go.
Well,
I'm sure you'll both have something to say.
Let me actually start from the second question, because I think that will facilitate my answer to the first one. Yes, absolutely. I think we need fundamental changes in institutions and norms, but I would say reform, not revolution, because I think especially at a time when the crisis will continue, to completely uproot existing institutions without knowing what you're putting in their place would be hard. And we have terrible track record in government or state efforts in trying to change social norms. I think social norms change much better when they are done gradually and when it's a bottom-up process. And in that context, I think being somewhat humble is actually a good thing, that recognizing we don't know things and also not try to do too many. I am definitely one of the people who's most alarmed about climate change within the economics profession. I think we need to take urgent action, but I think it would be a mistake to try to complicate our already very difficult challenge of dealing with the pandemic, trying to bring climate change immediately into it. The way I would think about it is that if we can deal with the pandemic and if we can get our institutions in order, that will empower us to deal with the climate change emergency later down the line. But I think right now our focus has to be in dealing with the pandemic, making sure that the depression doesn't become the greatest depression of the 21st centuries, and then try to rebuild our institutions. And if we can do that well, I think that's really great for our future.
Well, I very much agree with Darren, and myself. I've also advocated for a very, very long time that we are not doing enough against climate change, but we should not mix topics, which is, it will be very difficult actually to push the climate change agenda very fast, very far, at a time where there will be a deep recession. I mean, already the French government had done things right by putting a high carbon tax, and then the Yellow Jacket and others. It was very unpopular before the crisis, before the health crisis. So you would expect that people will think first about their purchasing power. Now, we still should take advantage of this shock to change mentalities and to put back the possibility of a carbon tax, a substantial carbon tax, to the fore. At the same time, social norms can be changed sometimes very effectively together with incentives. So take for example, tobacco in public spaces in Southern Europe, for example. We have had incentive and at the same time a norms-based intervention. Or plastic bags in Ireland in 2002. There was a tax, but at the same time a campaign to explain that was not right to use them. So sometimes you can do that, but we have to basically build a consensus in the society about the fact that we have to fight climate change.
Okay, a couple more questions. One on the ECB and its response. Maybe Jean's can be able to answer this. Isn't the choice in the Eurozone between the ECB financing corona-related spending or countries like Italy and Spain having to leave the Euro to escape an unbearable debt burden? We have a question on what do you think the impact of the crisis will be, I think specifically to Darren, on countries battling high inequality, particularly developing countries? And then a question on China. Will this affect global relations with China in particular?
Well, the first thing is that I don't think Italy or Spain will leave the euro, because if they have the euro, then that means that they will have a new currency, but their debt will still be denominated in euros. So that means that they will have to repay with a weak currency, and that will be very difficult. So they will default almost immediately, which means they will have to balance their budget almost immediately, and that will be a disaster for those countries. The ECB actually is helping, because the ECB is buying back debt. And I think, it's a kind of solidarity in Europe. It may turn into inflation at some point, that's true. But I think that's the way to go. I mean, I don't think leaving the euro could help in any way.
Let me so sorry, Tim, what was the
so there's a question on the impact on developing countries. There's a question on
inequality.
How is this going to affect relations with China?
Yeah, sorry. I was just thinking about the ECB. And so the I mean, I think this is actually a very important question, because the effects of the pandemic and the lockdown are actually very unequal already. If you take the developed nations, it is the people without savings and it is the people who are doing more manual tasks that are going to suffer more during this period. And the young and the old are suffering differentially in the lockdown. So I think those are part of the reasons why we have to think creatively about how we can start relaxing the lockdown in the right way, and also, you know, have broader set of voices. The same sets of issues, I think, are relevant when you look between countries. You know, the poorer countries don't have the resources to deal with for transfers or for supporting the business community. So I think that the situation is much harder. And when you go to the poorest countries, you know, sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Central America, they just don't have the infrastructure to be able to deal with the problem in any way. So that this sort of comes back to the thing that Jean emphasized and I emphasized, which is we really need much greater international interventions, international organizations really coordinating and providing resources, especially to developing countries. I think that the developing countries part has not been my focus because of lack of time, but I think it's really absolutely central.
Okay, a couple more things. I mean, some people have argued that the global financial crisis, we kind of wasted an opportunity to deal with many issues. Why can we be optimistic that this time it's different, in the sense that there will be these fundamental changes that you both described are needed, when at the time of the financial crisis, people were saying many of the same things? So can you articulate what you think are the fundamental differences between now and then? And the second is, surely this crisis is going to give succor to people who are a kind of economic nationalists. So while there's a belief that there is a need to change supply chains, isn't it going to be a sort of gift to people who are already arguing about the need for protectionism and economic nationalism more generally?
Yeah, so I think that's, first of all, I am not sure that we will do the right things. I'm just trying to articulate the optimistic position. I think there is, and by the critical juncture, I mean there will be countries that will do the wrong thing, and I hope there will be some that do the right thing. But there are some differences between the global financial crisis and now. First of all, this is much more severe, and I think it really makes it much more clear that we have an institutional failure. And second, I think during the financial crisis, there was a particular mindset which really made fundamental reform and institutional change really very difficult. And that was that the problem was a financial one, and we had to do our best in order to sort of shore up the banking system, and we couldn't do anything that really hurt the banks, and we had to make that the main priority. That was very clearly articulated by people like Sim Geithner, for example, in the US, and who even argued you didn't want to rescue people who were defaulting on their mortgages because that would be bad for banks. So that mindset essentially meant that you were going to recreate business as usual during and after the crisis. And I think we don't have such a mindset right now because the problem is very different. And I think the fact that there are more different policy options, I think creates a more of a parallel to, you know, what happened in, say, for example, in Sweden after 1932, or in the UK during and after the Beveridge Report, and thereafter in the continental Europe.
So Jean, let me just say that the crisis, I agree with Darren, it's a very different crisis, a much bigger crisis. And in the end, in 2008, it was a crisis of banking, and we were worried about the spillovers on the productive sector. Now, it's a reverse in a sense. The firms are in trouble that will actually have a spillover on banks, but it's a very different crisis. Now, I'm worried about economic nationalism, that's for sure. As I said earlier, there will be a lot of pressure from populations and firms to actually lobby for protection. Of course, it's a negative sum game in the end, so we are going to be in trouble. And then we have to, the big thing is thinking about the long term. So how do we make sure that citizens start thinking about the long term? And, you know, at some point for democracy to work, you need citizens to say, we are going to take less consumption and more investment. And you have to rebuild state capacity, as Darren said, but this short-termism exists even in countries where there's still a fair amount of state capacity. So in the end, you have to change social norms, and you have to change the way people think about these issues, and you have to supply them with information. That's why I was saying we need observatories which will have the right to inspect the countries, their policies, and are going to disclose how well their countries are doing with respect to the long-term goals.
Okay, well, we're reaching at 3 o'clock, which is the time we said we'd finish. Clearly, I'm seeing, you probably aren't, that there's still a huge number of questions and interest in everything you've had to say. And I'm not surprised, both because of the richness of your presentations, the range of issues you covered, the way you described, I think, genuinely novel thinking about all of those. It's been wonderful for us to spend the past hour listening to you, and a real privilege for us. So thank you so much, Jean and Daron, for making that possible. And thanks to all of you who've joined us for being a part of this. And I hope you'll join us for future webinars. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Leighton. Thanks, Jean.
Thank you.